And welcome everyone. This is Melissa Kapustin. I work here in Mayanot as a Jewish history teacher, and I'm also an attorney at the Rothenberg Law Firm in Hackensack. I normally teach on modern Jewish history, but I have taught previously in Mayanot both classical and medieval Jewish history as well. What I figured we'd do is actually take a look at the rabbinic perspectives on secular study throughout history, starting from the classical period, going into the medieval period, and then ending with the modern period. And when I say modern period, I mean really up until 1948. 1948 and onwards is really deemed the contemporary period because of the founding of the State of Israel, and it's a total different ballgame for Jewish history once we have the State of Israel. So we'll start with the classical period, and of course the question that I'm presenting is really, what is the attitude of rabbinic thought, or Jews in general, throughout history as to whether or not Jews can study secular studies? What is the view? We know today, obviously, we're dealing with some conflicts. I'm sure people are up to date in the latest news and an article that was posted in the New York Times with one organization that's trying to promote secular study and really demanding secular study in Hasidic schools in the United States. And that's an issue that is not new. It's not an issue as to whether or not within a Hasidic school or within a yeshivish school, whether or not secular studies is allowed. But it's a question that has been posed throughout history. And when did it really begin? When did we first see Jews contemplating whether or not they can look at the outside world and what can they take from the outside world? So the first source we have is really obviously a Gemara source. It's from what's deemed on top, and I'm sorry, some of the photocopies look like it was cut off on top, but this is referred to as the classical period of Jewish history. And in other words, it's also the Talmudic period, the Tannaitic era, the Amoraic era. Now what is this source discussing? Well, the first time we really see this discussion comes up with the concept of Chachma Yevanit. And what does Chachma Yevanit mean? Anybody? Chachma Yevanit.
Something about knowledge.
Greek wisdom, okay? Greek wisdom, Greek thought. So we see during the period of Hellenism, right, we just passed Hanukkah, okay, so we know very well the battle fought during Hanukkah had a lot to do with the spiritual aspects of Judaism. Less so physicality. You know, the Hellenists were willing to allow the Jews to live physically. That wasn't necessarily the battle. The battle was whether or not we could live with Rosh Chodesh and observing Shabbos and observing Kashrut and still working in the temple. So at the same time as Hellenistic thought is arising and is being promoted throughout the Hellenistic world, the Jews have to deal with that. How much do we allow our children to be exposed to Greek culture? Same question that we ask ourselves today in 2014. How much do we allow ourselves and our children to be exposed to secularism, to secular culture? So the question that arises in the Gemara here is whether or not you can teach your child Greek wisdom, secular thought. So we'll take a look at the first bracketed part. States Ben Dama, the son of Rabbi Shmuel's sister, once asked Rabbi Shmuel, "May one such as I, who has studied the whole of the Torah, learn Greek wisdom?" He thereupon read to him the following verse. "This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night. Go then and find a time that is neither day or night, and learn then Greek wisdom." Okay? So, clearly, what is the position of Rabbi Yishmael here?
They're against it.
They're against it, correct. If you can tell me during your day and your night when you have time to go ahead and learn Greek wisdom, when you're not actually engrossed in Torah, then go ahead and you can learn. But you're really supposed to be learning Torah all day and all night. Therefore, there really is no time. Okay? This, however, is at variance with the view of Rav Shmuel ben Nachmani. For Shmuel ben Nachmani said that in the name of Rav Yonatan, this verse is neither duty nor command, but a blessing. Okay? And which verse is he referring to? well, the reference that Rabbi Yishmael had made, okay, which is this book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate it therein day and night. Okay? So here we have Rav Shmuel Bar Nachai is saying, no, that is not necessarily a command that you have to be engrossed in Torah all day and all night. Rather, it's a blessing that Torah should be with you all day and all night. Therein, you have kind of an outlet wherein possibly you will have some time to learn Greek thought. Okay, so now we'll take a look at the next text, which is from a Tosefta in Avodah Zarah. It was asked of Joshua, may a father teach his son the wisdom of the Greeks? He answered, it may be taught at a time which is neither day or night, for it is said, this book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night. Okay, so here we have another opinion. Again, the same thing. No, there's no time. You're supposed to be engrossed in Torah all day, all night, therefore there's no time. Rav Joshua said, a father should not even take time to teach his son a craft, lest he cause his son to neglect the words of Torah, of which it is said, therefore choose life. This Tosefta goes a step further and says not only can't you study wisdom, secular studies, but what else are you not supposed to do? A craft, exactly. Take the time out and teach your son his profession. Okay? Therein, again, bringing up to contemporary times, to a great extent, the issue that we saw posted again in the New York Times and other articles with an organization that is asking, pleading with, really various different state and even trying to go to federal organizations, demanding that within Haredi schools they must teach secular studies so that their children can find a profession. According to the Tosefta, not only can't you learn Greek thought, Aristotelian thought, or any type of philosophy, or medicine, etc., but you shouldn't even go and teach your son a craft. That's one opinion. Now we're going to take a look at Rabbi Akiva. Okay, what does Rabbi Akiva have to say? This is from Sanhedrin, and this is elaborating a little bit from a historical point of view, but both Talmuds ask this question. The Palestinian Talmud amplifies Rabbi Akiva's declaration, prohibiting one who reads the outside books, such as the books of Ben Sira and the books of Ben Manach, but he who reads the books of Homer and all other books that were written from then on is considered like one who is reading a secular document. Hence, casual reading of Homer is permissible, but intensive study is forbidden. Okay? Rabbi Akiva's point of view is slightly different. What is Rabbi Akiva's point here?
To study it.
Okay, exactly. So can you read secular works?
Yes.
Yes, okay? But the difference is, do you read your secular works the same way you do your Torah?
No.
No, okay? And in fact, he declares, what was meant can you teach or, teach your son or learn secular Greek thought? What did Rabbi Akiva forbid? What did he forbid?
Intense studying of secular studies, like Homer, I guess.
Okay, so he actually allows for the reading of Homer.
Right, but
Okay?
not intensely.
Not intensely, correct, okay? But he also says the books of Ben Sirach. Anybody familiar with that?
Yeah.
That is the apocryphal works, okay? The works that were seen as quasi-Tanakh, okay? Meaning they were actually not books that were deemed ready and willing to be incorporated into Tanakh, but they were books that kind of mirrored it, that looked as if they were similar to the books of Tanakh. Those books that were written during the Greek period, that he forbids. But anything like a work of philosophy, a work of Homer, that you can read, okay, but not necessarily study it, okay? Now, we'll go down to the last part, and I think it's cut off on some of yours. The Babylonian Talmud reads, Rabbi Akiva adds, one who reads the outside books. A Tana taught this means the books of the heretics. Rav Yosef said it is forbidden to read the books of Ben Sira. Okay? So now even understanding Rabbi Akiva, there is this machlokas as to whether Rabbi Akiva banned the reading of any secular books or heretical works, or just the books like Ben Sira. Okay? So now
Barda, please come to Ms. F's office.
we'll take a look at the medieval period. So throughout the classical period, what we find is that, for the most part, Hellenism became part of Jewish culture. Okay, we know that Jews did in fact adopt Greek names. We know that they took obviously within the Siduki world, within the Sadducee world, they took on a lot of Greek culture, but we know that even those who were Perushim, those who were considered what's written in the book of Maccabees, the Hasidim of the day, the Maccabees themselves, they were not necessarily engrossed in Greek culture, but were they exposed to Greek culture? Yes, absolutely. Okay, so throughout Jewish history, we see that what we find within the Perushi world or the Hasidic world or in the world that's considered more to the right or more insular, they are keeping mostly Torah study is the only way to go, but you see that even within that world, there are variances. Some allow the study, not really this intensive study, but the looking at, the reading, casual reading of secular studies, and others will say no, absolutely not. So now let's take a look at the medieval period. Okay, we're in the medieval period where we know we're dealing with in France and in Germany, we have Christian culture. Within Spain and Portugal, the Jews are dealing with Islamic culture. Okay, so really from the period from 1000 until around 1500, we have Jews living in Western Europe, and in those places, the Jews are clearly going to be exposed to the culture around them. But the question is, what do they do with the culture around them? Similar to how they dealt with it in the classical period, or do we see any differences? So the first text we have here is actually a tshuva from the Rambam. Before we even go into the tshuva itself, the Rambam was a product of which culture? Sardi. Okay? So which secular culture was he dealing with? Islam, correct. Okay? So the Rambam, the first text we have, the Jews within the Rambam's world were dealing with the Islamic world. Okay? And what we're going to find is that the Jews living in the Islamic world, not only did they accept the culture around them, but Jews enhanced that culture. Jews were philosophers. Jews were mathematicians. Jews were scientists. Jews were doctors engrossed in medical studies. So we know the Jews living in the Islamic world embraced secular studies. Let's see the Rambam's opinion on this. It is widely known among our people that our sages instructed and warned us to learn the wisdom concerning the unity of God, as well as external forms of wisdom that will enable us to answer heretics and know the matters utilized by disbelievers to destroy our Torah. They also instructed us to study astrology and the vanities of idol worship, which one cannot learn from the Torah or the Talmud, as well as the measurements of land and knowledge of solstices and calculations. As the learned teacher of wisdom said, the pathways of the heavens are as clear to me as the pathways of Nehardia, and an understanding of the scope with which they measured at a distance on both land and sea. Moreover, they rule that no one can be appointed to the Sanhedrin to decide the law unless he knows these disciplines and medicine as well. So what is the Rambam advocating here?
He embraces it.
He embraces it, but he goes a step further. Not only does he embrace it, correct, okay? And he points out in particular who was appointed to the Sanhedrin. Only those who were learned both in Tanakh and Talmud, plus those who were learned in other disciplines, okay? Yeah.
Who are the sages on whom he's relying?
Okay, that's an excellent question. Who are the sages that he's relying on? So what he'll do is he'll go back to the Gemara time, okay? And he'll look to phrases such as we just read from Rabbi Akiva. Absolutely can learn Homer. He will look to other statements in the Gemara when they're discussing astrology, when they're discussing medical terms, etc. And what he says is, no, look, we're looking at the Tanam, we're looking at the Amoraim, and these were learned people. And they were not only learned in Talmud, not only learned in Tanakh, but they were learned in other things as well. Okay? In fact, the difference between the Jews of Ashkenaz and the Jews of Islam is that the Rambam says, no, look back in history, and you'll see that at every opportunity, the Tanaim had, the Amoraim had, the Jews of the Zugot had, the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, every time they had resources that were outside, they looked at them, they utilized them, they grabbed them, and they pulled them to help with their study of Torah. In Ashkenaz, however, they look at it entirely differently. And they say, no, anything you need to know, to understand about the world, where is it?
In the Torah.
Exactly. Okay, so you see a completely different point of view. Now we're going to look at another advocate of this same type of philosophy. This is actually taken from Jacob Ben Machir's work, and he was one who represented the Rambam and was deemed the Maimonidean controversy. What people should be familiar with is that the Maimonidean controversy was really a fight over whether or not Jews can learn the Rambam's works, but works of philosophy in general and secular studies in general. And it was a great battle. It was an unfortunate battle that occurred throughout the medieval era, late medieval era, between Ashkenazic Jews and the Islamic world. So much so that the Rambam's books were burned. Not much later, we actually found that the Talmud was burned as well. So can't necessarily correlate the two, but when Jews start burning each other's books, eventually the authorities will start burning our books as well. So this is again in defense of the Rambam. The most civilized nations who translate learned works from other languages into their own and who revere learning, has any nation changed its religion because of this? How much less likely is that to happen to us who possess a rational Torah? Okay? An argument made by Ashkenazic Jews at the time was you can't learn anything but Torah, but Gemara, no philosophy, no math, no astronomy, no astrology, none of that. Everything you need is found in the Torah. So much so that the Rambam's works, and he discusses philosophy, we need to burn them. They're a danger. They're going to take Jews away from religion. Okay? And in defense of the Rambam and defense of the culture of the Jews in the Islamic world, he writes, you see throughout history, people are interested in other people's cultures. And do they then abandon their own religion because of their interest, because they open up a book from another culture? His answer is no. Okay, so the response of the Islamic Jewish world was that it's not going to take us away from our Judaism when we learn secular studies. It's only going to enhance our Judaism. Now, does history prove them right or wrong? Neither.
Both.
Could go both ways.
Right, exactly, okay? So what kind of, let's say we were representing the Ashkenazic side, looking 500 years later, okay? Post-Spanish Inquisition, for example, okay? And you were an Ashkenazic rabbi living in this period who said, see, I told you those Jews in Spain and Portugal shouldn't be learning those secular works. What would you use as your proof?
Convert.
Exactly, okay? The numbers of Jews who converted to Christianity during the Spanish Inquisition, okay? And again, if you were an Ashkenazic Jew and you wanted to say, well, not only that, but I have proof from my own society that because we were so engrossed in Judaism alone with no outside sources, we never abandoned our religion. Do we have proof for that? Anybody?
The behavior of Ashkenazi Jews during the Crusades?
Correct. And what was the behavior of the Jews during the
Martyrdom.
Crusades? Martyrdom, exactly. Okay? How many Jews, when they were given the option in France and in Germany, convert or die, what did the overwhelming majority of them do? Die. Die at the hand of the Crusader, and later in history, not only throughout the Crusades, but in periods when there were issued either forced conversions, etc. So if you, again, were an Ashkenazic Jew looking back and saying, you see, look at those Jews that were engrossed in the Spanish culture. Look what happened to them. But what if you're the Spanish Jew? What if you're the Jew living in the Islamic world who became that philosopher, the Jewish philosopher perhaps? What would your argument be in defense of your reasoning as to why you should be allowed to study those?
Keeps you alive.
Okay, keeps you alive. All right, that's true physically. That's a good argument, okay, because those Jews who did convert, they were kept alive. Although, what happened to many of them? Many of the Marranos, they lived in fear for centuries, okay, till even today, where many crypto Jews who still keep their culture are still silent, are still too afraid to come out that they're Jewish because they're so scared that they're going to be hunted down and then they'll be in auto da fe and they'll be burnt at the stake, even today. But you're right, physically, yes. But anything else? Yeah.
Is it possible that the Jews did not find really in Judaism exactly what their minds were thinking, so they founded another religion. So they made a good combination, because maybe only on the religion of the Jews, there would not be so many famous Jews in the world.
Okay, so that's a very good point, and I think that will lead us right into our next discussion, which is the Jews of the modern period, okay? An argument that will come up will be, well, the Jews who were totally immersed in Torah and Talmud alone, what did they do when they started gaining citizenship in places? What happened when they were allowed to become part of the culture? In France and in Germany in the medieval period.
They assimilated.
They assimilated, exactly. So the argument was, we've got to stop the assimilation. So what do? Do you tell your kids, don't touch a secular book. Don't look at anything un-Jewish, okay? What happened to many of those Jews during the early modern period? They lost it completely, okay? But what if you tell your children, and this is the argument that kind of wins over and becomes modern orthodoxy, but what if you tell your children, yes, you can read some German books, some English books, some Russian books, but let's do it with understanding that the Torah is primary, and let's also interpret whatever you're reading, whether it's in science or in math or in philosophy, and let's look at it under the Torah's point of view. That was thought to be the way to save Jews from dropping it entirely. Okay, so when we enter the modern period, what we find is that Jews have this battle. It's no longer they have a knife or a sword at their throats, okay, and they're told to convert to Christianity, and that's their test. The test that we see the Jews face in Germany and in France and in England and the United States of America, okay, in the 1700s, in the 1800s, in the 1900s, is no longer this openly religious battle per se. It's a question of assimilation and acculturation, and how far do we allow our children to look at things from other cultures in order for them to stay within Judaism. So now here we have, and I brought you several sources within the modern period. I photocopied a lot from Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch, because he is an excellent person to look to for guidance in this, but obviously we're not going to get to everything. Yeah.
I was just going to mention that it's one of the themes of Rabbi Sachs of England, that there's two paths that God wants us, Hashem wants us to go on two paths, to go with the Torah and also go through science and through what Hashem made the world that we need to know about.
Right.
Even though we find everything in the Torah, eventually we figure out it's in there, but that's another path that he wrote so many books about, which I think are
Yeah, no, absolutely. Rabbi Sachs is a perfect example of somebody that's kind of able to do both and to encourage others to be able to do both. But we see kind of two sides of that, and we'll see that throughout the modern period and even until today, right? Why is it that in so many schools within the Hasidic world and in the yeshivish world, they don't want secular studies? And if they do have secular studies, it's 90 minutes a day, even if that, and it's deemed something that, you have to do, bury your heads in the book, don't look at it other than what you have to in order to learn
because
it.
they're afraid of it.
Correct. They're afraid of it, but it's also not only afraid of it, but it's an attitude towards it. Okay, if you look back in the Gemara and you saw this statement from Rabbi Yishmael, what's the attitude? Tell me tell me a time during the day and the night that you have that you're not supposed to be engrossed in Torah. That's a different attitude. So we'll see in the modern period what happens. This is actually a text from 1839, which is taken from somebody who commented on the Vilna Gaon. Now, the Vilna Gaon, we know, the Gaon of Vilna was considered one of the greatest men within definitely the 1700s, but even looking back in history, he was considered the leader of what was deemed the Misnagdi camp. He was anti-Hasidic. He didn't like the Hasidic movement emerging. He thought any change was no good. But what was his own point of view on secular studies? We know he didn't like change in terms of bringing any dancing in shul. He didn't like the change of being able to, sing about God and to, talk about God and not necessarily sit with your Gemara all day. But what was his actual view on secular studies? I cannot refrain from repeating a true and astonishing story that I heard from the Gaon's disciple, Rav Menachem Mendel. It took place when the Gaon of Vilna celebrated the completion of his commentary on Song of Songs. He raised his eyes towards heaven and with great devotion began blessing and thanking God for endowing him with the ability to comprehend the light of the entire Torah. This included its inner and outer manifestations. He explained, all secular wisdom is essential for our holy Torah and is included in it. He indicated that he had mastered all the branches of secular wisdom, including algebra, trigonometry, geometry, and music. He especially praised music, explaining that most of the Torah accents, the secrets of the Levitical songs, and the secrets of the Tikkunei Zohar could not be comprehended without mastering it. He explained the significance of the various secular disciplines and noted that he had mastered them all. Okay, so the Vilna Gaon himself, someone who we look to as somebody not only for his commentaries, his halachic abilities, but he himself views secular studies as being an integral part to learning Torah. Now we'll look at the next text, which is from Rav Yecheskel Landau's sermon. And what's interesting is he preceded Rav Hirsch, and Rav Hirsch we know is considered really the founder of Neo-Orthodoxy. But what was taking place in Germany is that the Reform movement was emerging. There was an argument whether or not Jews should be eligible for citizenship. And one of the arguments made in defense of Jewish citizenship was that, well, if we allow the Jews to become citizens, and there's anything in their religion that would prohibit them from being a full-fledged citizen, don't worry, the rabbis will abolish it. And in fact, the Reform Rabbinical Councils, which emerged in the 1800s, the Reform Rabbinical Councils say, you know what? We can chuck kashrus out the window, especially when you're dealing with business meetings, etc. We can chuck Shabbos observance out the window, especially when you need to get that job and you want to be the top lawyer, the top doctor, etc. Okay? So in a way, the arguments that were being made by non-Jews of the day, which was that, don't worry, we'll give them citizenship, they'll drop their Jewishness, watch. They're going to run to their citizenship so quickly that the rabbis will just get rid of what they need to in order to fit in. So that battle that was emerging within the Jewish world caught many of the Jews off guard, to the extent that many of them had been living the same way for centuries. And what was the way that they were living for centuries?
Torah Jews.
Torah Jews, exactly, okay? You learned your Gemara. You learned your Torah. You stayed within your Jewish community. There was a very strong kehila. What the rabbi said, you did. You followed. And if you didn't, up until the 1700s, if you were Mechalel Shabbos openly, befar Hesia, in public, in a Jewish kehila, in the medieval world, what happened? Chayrim. And it's not Chayrim today where we have this person putting that person in Chayrim, okay? It's not like that. What was Chayrim in the medieval period?
You were cut off.
You were cut off entirely. You couldn't exactly run to your next door neighbor, to your Christian neighbor, because the Christians definitely didn't consider you as one of them, unless you converted, of course, which unfortunately some did, after being excommunicated. But if you were excommunicated as a Jew and still wanted to live as a Jew, that was impossible. No one spoke to you. No one had you over for Shabbos. You couldn't walk into the shul. Nothing. Your society ended, basically. You were alone. So how many Jews were Mechalel Shabbos b'far Hesia? How many Jews did go into the non-Jewish tavern and have a drink with their local non-Jew?
Not many.
Very few, okay? Very few. But now we're in the 1700s. Now we're in the 1800s. And you can walk into that non-Jewish restaurant, you can sit at the tavern with your non-Jewish friends, and they're not going to try to kill you. And in fact, they may even welcome you. And what about your Jewish community? What happens when you walk back into your Jewish community? They may issue a chayrim, but if you start with 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, keep going up, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds who are like, wow, I don't have to be Jewish anymore? Are you kidding me? I have opportunity and I don't have to wear the kippah. I don't have to have the payos. I don't have to look Jewish anymore. I'm going to throw it out the window. Not only that, but when you had rabbis who were saying, you can only learn Torah. You can't open the German book. You can't listen to the German symphony. You can't look at German society and realize all the scientific studies that's going on. What happens to many of those young 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds? What happens to them?
Get
Well, they're gonna want it
curious.
even more.
Exactly,
Get
okay?
curious.
They run so fast to the culture that you completely exclude that they don't want anything to do with Judaism anymore. So people such as Rabbi Cheskel Landau and Rav Hirsch and Rav Hildesheimer say we can't allow this. We have to show our kids, we have to show ourselves that there are positive things about secular studies. That if we look at secular studies not as something that we have to shun entirely, that we have to throw out the window, but we can absorb to help us with our own Torah study, they won't leave Judaism. They won't leave it entirely. They'll actually be able to blend it together. So I'll read a little bit from his sermon. When a child is 6 or 7 years old, he should be taught the Torah in Hebrew, together with its translation into German, as it appears in Hebrew Bible printed in Berlin, Vienna, and Prague. He should master German and related subjects of importance. Anyone lacking the ability to read and write German cannot succeed in today's world. He will not gain entry to, nor become expert in any profession. It is obligatory upon every father to teach his son the language and the laws of the state in which he lives. Moreover, parents shall see to it that their children grow in Torah and Derech Eretz. The children shall pursue both, moving from level to level until they are 10 to 12 years of age, each according to his ability. When he is 12 years old, a judgment shall be made concerning his ability and character. If it is appropriate that he continues his studies, a determination will be made whether he should pursue secular study or Talmud, with Rashi and Tosafot leading to the rabbinate. If study is not for him, he should be taught a vocation or business skills, each according to his inclination. Okay? So Rav Landau says, we gotta start with the kids. We're not talking about starting secular studies at age 20. By 5 or 6, you gotta teach them the language, because otherwise, when they have the opportunity, and they're 10 and they're looking for it, and they're 12 and they're looking for it, certainly when the child reaches 13, 14, 15, and they're looking for the secular studies, let them already know it, but let them learn it inside of a school. Let them learn it in your home so they can discuss it with you and look at it under the Torah's confines. And now we look at Rav Hirsch. This is from his collected writings, and this was actually in response to an unfortunate event that happened in his community, which happened many times throughout the 1800s. Rav Hirsch was approached by hundreds of people who had come to him and said, my children have gone off the derech completely. They no longer want anything to do with Judaism. What do? I had a Torah home. All we discussed was Torah at the Shabbos table. I made sure when they got home from school, I took out the Mishnayos, I took out the Gemara, and I learned with them. How is it possible that my child went off the derech? How is it possible? And Rav Hirsch responds. And he responds not only to this individual, but he responds to the community at large in the 1800s. Is there anyone who does not remember this father as one of the outstanding and devoted champions of tradition in Jewish communal life? How he fought against all forbidden innovations at the synagogue and at our school, and saw to it that the religious institutions of our community should remain painstakingly faithful to the requirements of Jewish law. He regarded ignorance of things Jewish as the greatest of all evils. He viewed so-called modern education as the worst threat to Jewish survival because he felt it would supplant Jewish learning. Okay, so here's a father who did all of that, and he was a champion of Jewish knowledge and Judaism all over. Mr. Y, therefore, regarded it as a sacred matter of conscience, not only to get his sons to perform the duties of Judaism most scrupulously, but also to make them competent Torah Jews, by seeing to it that sacred writings of Judaism should remain virtually their only intellectual and spiritual nourishment. Moreover, in order to protect them from the poison of modern education, he not only anxiously isolated them from every contact with the moderns, but filled them with arrogant contempt for all other knowledge and scholarship that he deemed as nothing compared to the study of the knowledge given us by God. Okay, so here's an individual who sheltered his children completely. Anything that was un-Jewish, anything that was modern wasn't allowed in the house. Couldn't be talked about, couldn't be read, couldn't be discussed. And yet, all of his children ended up going off the derech. And Rav Hirsch continues, and I'll skip into the next bracketed part. if we want our children to develop a resistance to every kind of weather, so that wind and rain will only serve to make them stronger and healthier, we must expose them to wind and rain at an early age in order to harden their bodies. This rule holds good not only for a child's physical health, but equally for his spiritual and moral well-being. Right? So if you don't expose your children to the elements when they're young, how can you deal with it when they're older? And that's Rav Hirsch's point in terms of establishing an educational system in which the concepts of secularism is brought in to further Jewish study. And I'll just read one more from Rav Hirsch and go on. Remember that our children will not remain forever under the sheltering wings of our parental care. Sooner or later, they will inevitably have contacts and associations with their un-Jewish brethren in the Jewish world. If in this alien environment they are to remain true to the traditions and the way of life in which they were raised at the home of their parents, if we want them to continue to perform their duties as Jews with calm, unchanging determination, regardless of the dangerous influences, and even more dangerous, the ridicule and derision that they may encounter, indeed, if the contrast they note between their own way of life and that of the others will only make them love and practice their sacred Jewish heritage with even greater enthusiasm than before, then we must prepare them at an early age to meet this conflict and to pass this test. We must train them to preserve their Jewish views and to preserve in their Jewish way of life precisely when they associate with individuals whose attitudes and way of life are un-Jewish. Okay? Rav Hirsch says it is a requirement of all parents to approach the topic, to approach the idea of anything un-Jewish with their children, because if not, what happens when they're exposed to it later on in life? Yeah.
But this is very different than the Rambam viewing the secular world as having so much positive to offer.
Mhm.
This is basically the secular world is diseased, and we just want to inoculate them in some fashion so that they're able to resist it. It's a much more negative, at least this segment of it, is
Okay,
a much
that's
more
a good
negative,
point.
a much more negative view of what's out there.
Okay, that's an excellent point. So this was actually written in response, unfortunately, to those who were kind of arguing against Rav Hirsch and others like him. Because Rav Hirsch faced criticism from those of the likes of, let's say, the Chassam Sofer during his day. And what was the Chassam Sofer's view during his day? Anybody? Nothing new under the sun. You can't learn German. You can't teach your child German. You can't learn their music. Nothing. You can't. And Rav Hirsch's response is, we have to. There's no longer the luxury of debating whether you can or cannot teach your son secular studies. Rav Hirsch says we're living in a different era. We don't have the luxury of debating philosophical studies. We're living in a day when our children are being exposed, whether we want them or not. Either they're being exposed at home or they're going out in the street and they're looking at it, they're watching it, and they're saying, wow, I want a taste of that. And even more, they're seeing their neighbors. They're seeing their neighbors who are becoming part of the reform movement. And they're saying, wow, if they can do it, I can do it too. But the truth is, Rav Hirsch writes beautifully about the concept of Torah and Derech Eretz. Like Rav Yecheskel Landau, that concept. That it's not anything in conflict. That in fact we're to use secular studies, much like the Rambam had stated, use secular studies to enhance our knowledge of Torah. And in fact, Rav Hirsch says it's a beautiful thing. Use the music of the day. Use the science of the day, use the math, use the philosophy, and you'll see the more you study in the outside world, it will greater enhance your study of Torah. When you open up a pasuk and you have a concept of what was going on in ancient Near Eastern history, it will help you further understand the context of the Torah. When again, any concept that we have in the Torah, Rav Hirsch, in fact, does deem it as a beautiful thing. Okay, moving on to the next text. It's from Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg. Okay, who is actually an advocate and more so quoted for his more against right-wing viewpoints, okay? More or less keeping up the legacy of the yeshiva of Volozhin, of Eastern European yeshivot, in which they studied Torah, and Torah, and Torah, and Talmud, okay? So the quote from Rav Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg is commenting on Rav Hildesheimer, okay? Rav Hildesheimer himself, who established seminaries in Germany in which he taught rabbinic students that they needed to know both Talmud and Tanakh, as well as, of course, secular studies. Okay, so this was a comment from an Eastern European rabbi, but who we know in Eastern Europe, there was less of a changing tide than there was in Western Europe. The yeshivot of old in Poland and Lithuania and Russia, if you needed a real gadol, where did you get your rabbi from in the 1800s and the 1900s? Where did you get him from? Did you get him from Germany?
Poland.
No, you got him from Poland, or you got him from Russia. In fact, the very quote-unquote Orthodox communities throughout the world, when they wanted an Orthodox rabbi, they turned to the yeshivot of Eastern Europe. Okay? So now we have a quote from one of these leaders in Eastern Europe commenting on what's happening in Germany. Those seminaries or those places in Germany where they're educating in both secular studies as well as in religious studies. Rabbinic leaders in 19th century Germany were experts in the field of Jewish education. That is why they succeeded in raising whole generations of Jews who were at once pious and secularly educated. No such success can be ascribed to the rabbinic leaders of Lithuania and Poland. They did not know how to attune Jewish education to their time and circumstance. Rav Yisrael Salanter, after returning to Eastern Europe from Germany, told how he had witnessed Rav Azriel Hildesheimer teaching Bible and codes to young women. He commented, "If a Lithuanian rabbi would ever institute such a practice in his community, he would be fired, and justly so. Nevertheless, may my share in the world to come be the same as that of Rav Azriel Hildesheimer." Okay? So, obviously the viewpoint of the Lithuanian, Polish, Galician, Russian community was, what do you do with those Jews in Germany sitting there and reading not only Torah, Talmud, but secular studies? How would that fly in the Lithuanian community? He would be fired so quickly, okay? And everybody would get up and say, uppy courses, okay? You can't teach this type of thing. But looking at what's happening in Germany, knowing the population of Jews in Germany and what they're facing, what does he say about Rav Hildesheimer's viewpoint, which is very much like Rav Hirsch, which is concept of Torah in Derech Eretz and the requirement of Torah in Derech Eretz? What does he say about that? It's good. May it be blessed. Okay? And then I end here with actually the author chose to remain anonymous when he wrote this, but this is actually in response to Rav Eliyahu Dessler's view, which was written in critique of what's deemed the Frankfurt Way. The Frankfurt Way was Torah Mada, Torah in Derech Eretz, allowing your children to learn both Torah and secularism. And this was written in response. Okay? I've heard that their view on these matters came very close to that of Rav Samson Raphael Hirsch, but that they were outnumbered and opposed by the majority of Eastern European rabbis at the time. It seems to me that this was always the case historically. The majority of rabbis refused to engage in secular study lest they be ensnared by it. Okay, so this is somebody commenting, Eastern European Jews, some had thought, you know what, maybe we should also try to stop the tides of assimilation in Eastern Europe. Maybe we should bring in secular studies in our yeshivot. And what was the overwhelming response? Absolutely not. Okay? And we'll just skip down to the last part, just so we end on a positive note. Who knows, it may well be that both approaches, Torah and Derech Eretz and Torah only, are true, both reflecting the essence of Torah. What is crucial is that one's intent be for the sake of heaven, always according to the Torah primary status, and making secular study secondary. No rabbinic court ever banned secular study. Indeed, the Torah scholars of the various generations never ruled officially in favor of the one approach over the other. Everyone is free to select whichever approach finds favor in his eyes. Let him consult his teachers and follow in the footsteps of his forefathers. The followers of the one approach must respect the followers of the other approach. They may not cast aspersions on the approach they reject. To the contrary, they must provide support for each other. Okay? So this is someone writing in response to someone critiquing Frankfurt Way, Torah in Derech Eretz, and saying, we don't know which way is right. No one ever came out with an outright ban saying your child cannot learn secular studies. Yet, in Eastern Europe and many yeshivot today in the United States and other places, Torah only, Torah only. And this author writes, It doesn't matter which way. We don't know which way. For some of us, okay, those engrossed in secular culture, those facing the challenges of keeping our children on the right path, for those of us in that environment, we may need Torah in Derech Eretz to make sure our children don't go off the path. In other environments, like obviously those who are fighting the battle saying, no, we never want our children to have to study secular education, that's the Torah-only approach. The bottom line is, what do we need? Respect, exactly. Okay? So whether or not, those of us sitting in this room believe, yes, absolutely, we must have Torah in Derech Eretz. Of course our children need to read secular books and study secular knowledge. That may be true for us, but the bottom line is the Torah-only approach may work for others, and as long as we respect both sides, that is the way to ensure that Torah continues.